Thanks so much for joining, everyone. This is a really informal session, so feel free to turn on your camera, go off mute, ask a question, raise your hand to ask a question, or ask a question directly in the chat. Today we are joined by Patrick and Savin, and we're going to be talking about how to get your first few customers, or even not users, design partners, just the first few users of your product and how you go about doing that. Arguably one of the hardest parts of building a startup. And so, yeah, we have two experts here with us to chat through how to go about it. They've done it. Yeah, make sure to ask all your questions and take as much knowledge from them as you can. I'm Francisca, if you haven't met me. I used to work with Patrick. So he's my former boss. So if he's saying anything that's not true, I will call him out. Just kidding. Work at Amplitude now with Patrick. We were acquired last year. But I'll pass it over to Savin to give a background and then over to Patrick after, so you get to know them a little bit before we dive into the questions.
So, yeah, thanks, Francisca. I'm Savin. I used to be at Netflix until mid last year. And then for the last 8 to 9 months, I'm building a startup in the ML system space called Out of Bounds. So we do have an open source project that we are building on top of called Metaflow, and I'm happy to share my learnings in the next 1 hour. Over to you, Patrick.
Hey everyone, I'm Patrick, currently Director of Product for all things governance, working on the data side at Amplitude, previously co-founder, CEO of Iteratively, working with Francisca. So I think she's pretty well equipped to talk about this as well and how we acquired our first customers, but really excited to talk to everyone today.
Awesome. Well, let's dive in. I'll start with you, Savin. Can you explain a little bit, just dive in, tell a story. How did you go about even sort of starting on finding your first users? What went into the process? Anything that you can share there?
Yeah, sure. So I think we had the luxury of leading with an open source product. So our journey of finding customers didn't really start like last year, but it started 4 years back when we started on the project at Netflix. And for us, ultimately at the end of the day, the goal was not to build technology, not to build tools, but to build products. And we essentially started canvassing teams internally at Netflix, trying to understand what were their pain points, moonlighting as extra engineers on their team, getting their job done, to buy their trust, to understand all the small little paper cuts that they were sort of like running into. And we pretty much did that with 4 or 5 different groups over sort of like a duration of 6 to 8 months. And that sort of like then informed like, okay, what would the early internal product sort of like look like? And that's how we iterated. That's how then we were able to sort of like also spread the good word amongst other teams. Our goal was not as much around customer acquisition, but also customer delight. Because, it's not just that, you need sort of like the first 2 customers or 3 customers that can come from your immediate network, but then it's also sort of like, finding the next few customers and making sure that whatever you have built so far, it travels well outside your immediate network. And then once we were able to do that, a few years later, then we open sourced the product. We ended up sort of like, hitting the conference circuit just to sort of like spread the word. And that helped in some amount of inbounds. But then at the same time, we also wanted to sort of like pivot the conversation from like, hey, how do I go about using, your open source project, but more towards like, okay, let's start this dialogue, understand what are your pain points. Some of those pain points could be addressed by our open source project, but we are more curious, more interested to understand that, okay, there are certain problems we have seen internally at Netflix, but different organizations, they behave differently. Their problems are different. The way they think about problem solving is very different. Can we really understand that particular perspective? And can we just be really helpful and, help you sort of like solve the problems? Maybe sort of like what we have built so far may be useful to you. Maybe it's something else that we need to build and deliver to make you successful. But buying that customer trust, that was really important for us early on. And then that helped us with word of mouth, and eventually sort of like that has become strong enough that we have now a healthy inbound pipeline of customers for us.
How was the transition from Netflix? Like you had obviously a rich customer base there, and you could tap into like starting your own. How did you navigate sort of that without, upsetting Netflix or yeah, being fair in the market and everything else?
Yeah, no, of course, it was a very natural transition as well. And of course, Netflix for the last sort of like decade and a half has had sort of like a long list of great open source projects. So we weren't sort of like a unique snowflake in any way. One thing that I definitely sort of like sorely missed was Netflix culture, because our internal customers, they would be brutally candid with their feedback. And then our sort of like immediate goal after spinning out of Netflix was how can we establish a similar level of trust with our open source adopters so that we can sort of like, tap into their data science talent to get that immediate strong feedback. And I mean, ultimately, at the end of the day, if you're asking sort of like, any customer, whether a current customer or a prospective customer, to spend a lot of time with you, giving you brutally honest feedback, there has to be a win for them as well. And for us, sort of like, just focusing on their pain points, solving, all sorts of boring problems that they may not want to solve by themselves. That was really important to sort of like get to really high fidelity feedback again, which we had, very easy access to at Netflix.
Got it. Not sure how applicable this is to your open source project, but I was actually just on a call with someone this morning about this. And were you able to know your customer on the open source side? Did you have tracking in that, or did you have them register with you, or how did you actually communicate with or get access to your users?
Yeah, great question. Of course, with open source projects and the kind of organizations that we were targeting, it was very difficult to introduce any kind of tracking. And, till this date, we do not have a full grasp of who all are using our open source project. But then for us, open sourcing didn't only mean that, we had sort of like some code that was out there under Apache license and some documentation. What we also sort of like went forward with was this fanatic level of user support that, if you had sort of like any questions, any concerns about our project, or if you just wanted to talk about data and ML with us, you would essentially get pretty much an immediate response. And that definitely, given sort of like the realities of the pandemic and everybody in different time zones, that required sort of like very long nights, helping out people in the community as well. But then that gave us a strong signal of who was using our project, what were their pain points. It also sort of like, bought us many fans, and that helped us sort of like, spread the good word around. And I mean, we've already started on the journey, to be very honest. Like there's still sort of like a lot of work cut out for us, but it's one sort of like great learning for us that, like you can focus all day long on like tracking customers and acquiring customers, but if you manage to sort of like, keep a few of them really, really happy, like that's sort of like, in many ways, the secret sauce of growing your customer acquisition over a longer period of time. So it's not like, we were in the market for like, hey, how can we acquire 100 customers or 1,000 customers in a month? More about like, okay, let's just like find 10 people that we can really help, and then they will sort of like, become our influencers in terms of acquiring the next 10 customers, the next 20 customers, and over a longer period of time, this sort of like flywheel will then sort of like kick in and help us scale.
Yeah, the word of mouth loop. Yeah,
exactly.
It's real for sure.
And
All right, Patrick.
Working, so yeah, very real.
Yeah. I'll pass it to Patrick. Do you want to share a little bit more about how you got, so this is a different angle, right? More sort of business top down, getting teams adopting a tool as opposed to sort of users first.
Yeah,
Want to share?
Happy to chat a little bit about it as well. So to provide more broader context, obviously we were a product that was sold into teams most closely, at least at the end of the day. We did kind of have our own kind of PLG motion. Essentially, we tried that for about 2 years, but ultimately what ended up kind of being more successful for us as far as our go-to-market motion was definitely more of a sales-driven approach at the end. And I'd say even more closely aligns with kind of what we're doing now, even at Amplitude. Although I definitely think PLG and having product qualified leads definitely helped. To talk a little bit more about kind of actually how we started the business, we actually had no idea what we really wanted to do. I previously worked at Atlassian, and before that worked with my co-founder, Andre. So we did a ton of customer discovery. So the way that we actually identified our early customers was through customer discovery. We had no real pre-collection of what we wanted to build. We knew who we wanted to build solutions for, which was other product organizations. So we spent 6 months without writing code or doing any designs, really just talking to teams out there around what problems they actually faced, which inevitably was related to data quality. Ended up putting kind of a solution deck together, went and validated that with a lot of customers. So for us, when it actually came to finding our early kind of lighthouse customers or design partners, we already had kind of a lot of customers who were telling us that this was a pain point for them. So it was really easy for us to go back to them, validate that we had the right idea, get a bunch of LOIs or letters of intent that we then used to kind of measure the level of pain that we were solving for them. And then we ended up building kind of an MVP within about 3 months and launched that about 9 months after leaving Atlassian. To have actually real design partners using our solution. So it's definitely a helpful process for us. As part of that customer discovery process, one of the things that was really beneficial was actually defining kind of where our customers hung out. So what were the communities, what were the channels for us that we could then later on use for customer acquisition. But because we didn't actually know what we were building, that first 6 months was purely just around trying to drive value to a lot of these communities. So ended up, if people had questions or if they needed help on hiring or if they needed any sort of more broader help, what we were really trying to do is just drive more value into these communities. That really ended up paying kind of dividends long-term for us when it came to actually building these relationships, meaningful relationships, deeper relationships with our customers. And these communities where our ideal champion, our ICPs hung out. And that was, for us on the data side, communities like Locally Optimistic, DBT, Measured Community, and then building kind of real authentic relationships that we could then use for both customer discovery as well as kind of design partners with inevitably what we ended up building. Again, for us, it was definitely a complex sell. So we were involving both engineering, we had product managers involved, we had heads of growth involved, we had marketers involved, data people involved. So it's definitely a complex sell. So it was a little bit harder to obviously penetrate. Once you actually found a person, you had to then have multiple different calls. You had to put success plans in place. It would take multiple months to get successful with these organizations, but inevitably we ended up getting the kind of the ACVs in a spot where it was a bit sustainable at the end of the day. And we were solving kind of acute problems for obviously customers or, our customers' companies like Amplitude. So Francis, any questions about that?
Lots of questions. No, I think that just to reiterate on the community front, I think you did an awesome job just being active and helpful in a lot of the data communities. And it was very clear later on down the line when someone had a question about anything tracking plan related, Patrick was now like a thought leader. And so people would tag him in naturally in these conversations. And so it generated awareness about Iteratively and Patrick as a person. So while it wasn't like directly like brand building of Patrick as like a person, it was sort of indirectly, if you have questions about this, Patrick is a good person to ask. And it was very objective, right? Like you weren't pushing the product necessarily, you were just giving advice. So that seemed very powerful. Besides the communities, Patrick, what else, how did you get, so I think you ended up at like, was it like 500 or 600 calls in Notion where you had, there's so many calls. Like how did you, besides the communities and finding contacts there, how did you like get meetings booked with these people?
So there's obviously two ways that typically teams approach this. One is obviously outbounding, the other is kind of inbounding and building kind of those flywheels. We spent a lot of time on content, which you took over at the end of the day, but we wrote a lot of content in the early days. We posted a lot of messages on LinkedIn about what we're working on. So we mostly built in public, essentially. We were definitely not like a stealth company. And I think the first blog post I wrote on what is a tracking plan ended up being kind of the highest converting blog posts that we had when it came to generating leads. And so we had a lot of inbound interest. And what we would do is on those calls, we weren't trying to sell essentially. We're like, hey, yeah, this is what we're doing, but we weren't trying to sell. We were definitely, that wasn't our default MO. It was really to try to learn what problems that customers faced. And this is once we were in market, right? This was obviously about 9 to 12 months after we started the company. But once we're in market, our still goal is to actually learn. So we're constantly always trying to learn from our customers so that we can build the right product for them, that we can understand positioning, that we can understand how to tie the value that we're creating directly to the problems that companies like them faced. Even to this day, I think this week I have 17 customer calls this week, which are mostly all discovery related. So I think customer discovery is probably the number one thing I'd recommend for people when they think about what they're building, is how to kind of transition from thinking about selling your product to understanding what is the problem that my customers are facing and how does my product connect to that value. And then if your product doesn't, don't sweat it. It's probably not a good fit anyway. So try to figure out how you can then build a meaningful relationship with this person to actually solve their problems, even if it's not directly related to what you're doing. We've had a lot of conversations with folks who inevitably end up going to another organization where they bring us in, or an existing Iteratively customer who transition roles into a new team that then brings us in. So I think focusing on meaningful, authentic relationships is definitely one thing that I find valuable here. And from somebody who doesn't have a sales background or experience, is definitely the right way that I think about it when it comes to actually selling my product experience. I want to, for me, everything is not transactional. I don't want things to be a transactional relationship. So that's one of the things that I'd focus on. I think customer discovery is just an easy way to build a framework where it doesn't feel like a transactional relationship. I see there's some questions here as well in Slack that I can probably jump into. I know. Go ahead, Francisca.
Yeah, I'll take the first one. Maybe both of you can answer this one. So like, what were the core drivers of customer discovery? And we want to get like real specific here. Did you do any cold calling? What did you do exactly? Get super granular.
Savin, you want to take it?
Yeah, sure. So we haven't sort of like relied on cold calling yet. I mean, the problem space that we are targeting, there are quite a few people who are actively looking for solutions. So it's more about like, how do we get in front of them in venues that they are present in, right? So there are like many other communities around these problems that, we hang out in. And of course, as Patrick mentioned, nobody wants to sort of like, engage with a vendor who is actively pitching their product. So it always has to be a solution oriented approach that, like, here's a problem. How do you sort of like solve that problem from a first principles approach? And of course, if your product sort of like happens to do the same thing, that's good. But if not as well, you need to be seen as a thought leader in that community. So doing that more and more, I think that's sort of like the only scalable process. You can start cold calling and that will sort of like, get you some number of leads. But if you're not sort of like getting out there and positioning yourself as a thought leader in the community, then you can't, at the end of the day, scale out the cold calling process. It gets you sort of like started, but isn't really sort of like a viable process in the long term. So very specifically, our goal was, attend conferences, speak at podcasts, write blog articles, many sort of like SEO hacks as well, so that when people are typing, their pain points, then whatever we have sort of like positioned out there, that sort of like bubbles up at the top. So those were sort of like some of the key drivers towards customer acquisition. But then once we sort of like started having a healthy number of customers that we were engaging with, then the focus was, it shifted towards just like learning as much as possible from those customers and then spreading that word of mouth through them.
Patrick, anything to add there? Any sort of hacks? I know we used LinkedIn a little bit.
I never literally called somebody on a phone in my life. So I never actually, in the context of cold calling, I've never actually done that. We'll probably
don't call a developer.
We'll probably never ever do that. It's just not my default MO. I would feel so uncomfortable doing that to somebody. I think as far as customer discovery, I think, again, it was really kind of from an authentic perspective. There's always customer discovery disguised, or there's sales disguised as customer discovery. I think good salespeople can incorporate customer discovery into the process. It helps them better understand the problem, the value creation, as well as capture. So I think that's like the one takeaway. Like, I wish I knew more about sales when I started a company. I know a lot now, which obviously feel a lot better and more empowered. And I'm really involved in a lot of sales conversations these days. When it comes to customer discovery, for us, again, it's identifying the channels, right? These are folks that you want to solve problems for. And if you can identify the problems that they should have a natural inclination to actually want to jump on a call with you because you are solving their problems, right? Like if somebody's like has a huge deep pain point and somebody's like, oh, if I have a huge deep pain point, somebody's like, hey, I can solve that for you. Of course, I'm going to want to talk to them, right? So this is, again, it's around identifying who your ICP is, who your champion is, understanding where they hang out, and then how you position kind of the problem that you're solving for them so that it resonates. And then from there, the goal is obviously just get them on a call so you can better understand this. So for us, like we did do some outbounding, but like I think our conversion rate on outbounding was pretty high generally when it comes to industry average. I think the thing that was helpful for us is that we weren't trying to pitch a solution. We were really trying to understand their problem. So we didn't actually talk about what we were doing in any of our outbounding messaging. It was all like, hey, I was previously working at Atlassian. I'm interested. I'm starting a new company. We're interested in talking to folks like growth marketers or developers or PMs, who I was targeting at the time when we were doing our discovery. Are you interested in grabbing 30 minutes? I can just learn a little bit more about how you build products or at your organization. And we actually had a really high response rate for that because people generally want to talk about the problems that they have, right? Like, so I would think about this as like not cold calling, but discovery is definitely valuable. If you've not read the book, Disciplined Entrepreneurship is a great book. It kind of provides you some guide rails. It was definitely what I followed more closely as well. So I would recommend that. But yeah, it should come across as pretty authentic.
What about the actual sort of steps in the discovery process? How did you assess the customer pain points?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in here. There's 3 steps in my mind from customer discovery. One is like problem validation, solution validation, and business model validation. Like I think we spent about 6 months, let's just say 6 months on the problem validation. We spent about 1 month on the solution validation and not a whole lot of time on the business model validation, which is like a learning on my side. Thinking about like how the product should be sold, like what is the go-to-market motion, like all those things are equally as important as like making sure you're actually solving the right problem and that you have the right solution. It just wasn't, our founder DNA wasn't in the later side. We didn't have as much experience there. But when it comes to actually identifying, we recorded all of our calls. So every single customer interview was recorded. We used a tool called Grain. We did try to do cross-call synthesis as well to understand what are the consistent problems that we're facing. What is the breadth and depth of the problem? So breadth is one important indicator to understand like how consistent do I hear this problem, but the depth of pain is definitely another indication here. Like how much, like, is this a top 3 pain point for them? How much does this keep them up at night? What is the impact on the business because of this pain point that they're facing? Because your goal is obviously to try to find a problem that has a high, pretty applicable, generally applicable, but then also has a high degree of pain that's not being solved by the existing solutions or vendors or other tools on the market today.
Yeah, and if it's not clear, like you also had a template, right? You had you asked the exact same questions every time, so it was easy to sort of look across calls. Yeah. And
as Francisca knows, we still have that same template even at Amplitude today that I use in all my calls. It's a very helpful template.
Yeah. There's a specific question on letters of intent. So, like, how did you actually land the customer? Did you have a contract? Was it just sort of promise?
It was more of a handshake. Yeah, it was definitely more of a handshake agreement and actually going through letters of intent at Amplitude now. So this is my second time going through this process with an upcoming product launch. So like it's definitely more of a handshake agreement, specifically at Iteratively. Our goal is obviously to get some conviction. So letter of intent is just to add more friction to the process. And this might seem counterintuitive, but your goal is to add more friction to the process. That way you're validating, 1, that this customer actually has the pain point, 2, that you have the right solution, and 3, that they're willing to pay for it if you actually do have pricing in your letter of intent. And so the goal is to shift as much of that burden earlier on in the conversation. Then you actually engage with them, you work with them for multiple months, you ship all these features, and inevitably they end up churning out, but you have no real insight. So the goal is, again, to think about reversing kind of your funnel, putting all the burden up front, getting the LOI, making that a labor-intensive process so that you have a higher conviction or win rate with the letters of intent to closed or successfully converted customers.
Yeah. Savin, you're nodding. Anything you want to add?
No, I completely agree. So I think when it comes to building a company, the very first thing that you need to do is build a product that people want to use. So the first sort of like goal of customer discovery is always to sort of like assess the pain point. And it's especially difficult when you're talking to developers, because as developers, everybody wants to tell you what kind of solution they expect. So you have to sort of like, dig a little bit deeper to understand what is the problem that they are trying to indeed solve. And you have to look beyond sort of like the solution that they are positioning towards you, because I mean, we have sort of like, previously made the mistake very early on in our careers of just like, building the solution that our users were asking for, and that never sort of like, goes well. And then of course, once you have sort of like properly assessed what is the actual pain point that you're trying to solve, that also sort of like, in many ways, you start off with this Brownian motion of talking to a few customers to assess what is the most appropriate target customer that you're going after. And after that, there shouldn't be sort of like any excuses why your product isn't really resonating with that target audience, right? Like if let's say you're getting sort of like, many declines, or people are not really bought into the vision that you are trying to sell, then that's sort of like a clear signal for course correction at that point. So customer discovery sort of like it pairs into customer acquisition, as well as how you are thinking about your business model, as well as your product approach in many ways. And I mean, actually, we do not have any specific template for any of these conversations yet. It's mostly sort of like, all the founders who are leading these conversations, and we are trying to just maximize information gain. And the kind of companies that we sell to, there isn't a lot of standardization. And we are hoping to sort of like, with many of these conversations, come to a standardized approach that then sort of like, in the next step of our customer discovery process can feed into like, okay, how do we now sell this? How do we commercialize it? The first goal is always to figure out, is this a pain point? What is the actual real pain that people are running into? And then hopefully can we convince these companies to use our product and give us feedback and be happy with the product. And then at a later stage, we sort of like concern ourselves with monetizing that product.
The only thing I'd add there is the template helps, in my mind, avoid confirmation bias. So like for me, it's very easy to ask leading questions. So like the template is a crutch that I use personally, so that I'm not looking for confirmation. The other thing that I feel about customer discovery that I feel a lot of people generally get wrong, which I try to give a lot of advice on these days, is like you should be actually trying to disprove any of your ideas or hypotheses. You're not looking for validating your ideas. In my mind, you're looking to disprove your ideas. So as soon as you like switch the lens of going into validation to actually trying to invalidate your hypothesis, you ask way better questions. You dig to the point of it. Again, you don't want to waste your time building a startup that nobody actually has a need or desire for. So you should be trying to actually kill your ideas as early as often as possible, which shifts the frame of reference for most founders in my mind.
I have another question. So maybe one for each of you as well. So what's your best design partner, and what made the relationship the most successful for your startup? And then maybe try to comment a bit over time as well. Like how was the relationship in month 1, month 0, month 3, month 6, month 12? How did that evolve?
Yeah, I can start with that. So I think the relationship with every design partner varies, because you're seeking potentially different outcomes from different design partners, right? Like companies, they have like, different maturity in their organizations. They're thinking about your product in a very different manner. So some design partners are sort of like, teaching you like how to navigate org structure so that you can sell to sort of like, the eventual buyer. Some other design partners are helping you sort of like on the ground ideate through the product and sort of like, figure out like bugs in the solutions that you have shipped to them. So it varies. I think, the sign of sort of like a great design partner is where sort of like the communication is bi-directional, and there's sort of like a high trust relationship as well. And of course, high trust relationships, they do not form on day one. So you have to sort of like constantly keep working on it. And there's always this onus on us to sort of like go beyond our way to help them out with sort of like, anything that may not even be sort of like directly related to what we are selling. So I think if I sort of like, look back, of course, we had the luxury of having Netflix as sort of like a great design partner. We came from Netflix. Netflix still uses us, is probably sort of like, one of our biggest customer from a design point of view. But then at the same time, there were many other sort of like organizations, if I look back over the last year and a half, their usage of our product, if it isn't outstripping Netflix, it's still sort of like at a similar scale. And that could only happen if, let's say, these design partners, these individuals, they had a strong degree of confidence in us. So I think it was definitely a long journey. I don't think we ever sort of like went back and looked at like, how that relationship sort of like evolved over specific milestones of like 1 month, 3 months, and 6 months. Maybe that's something we should start doing. Mission.
Pro tip.
Yeah, it's nice actually being part of Amplitude, because I actually get to see how more sales organizations handle this with like, EBRs on a quarterly basis, like building out your own kind of customer advisory board. So some of the things I obviously didn't know being an independent founder, but like I would consider that, our first 2 paying customers, Thrive Market and Beekeeper, were super valuable when it came to just giving us product feedback and actually shaping the direction of what we were building. And we were meeting with them the time probably bi-weekly. So we had very regular check-ins and cadences of being able to sync with them. The 2 champions at each of those organizations ended up just really falling in love with what we were doing, because it was kind of a bit of a novel approach to the problem that we were solving. And then some of the engineers at those organizations became some of our biggest fans. And like anytime we had a bug or an issue, they would just like continue to give us feedback. So it was always great to see the level of commitment from these organizations. I'd say actually the one that's top of mind for me was actually Carter, which was our first enterprise contract that ended up churning because we just weren't ready at the time. Like we didn't have a solution that was going to meet their needs. And it was a painful lesson to me as a founder, because obviously you want to make these customers successful. But the feedback that they actually gave us, it forced us to go a little bit more upmarket, forced us to go focus on things like soft compliance. It forced us to go hire more people to actually build some of the things that they were requesting. And I still think to this day, without their feedback, we probably would have been in a different position and situation than where we are today. As far as like the companies that I work with more closely today, and Francisco is obviously very aware of some of these customers, but like Snick is a great example of a customer who we work with very closely. They're just so spot on finding all the buried bodies in our experience and giving us very concrete feedback. They're very committed as a partner to making sure that we build the things that are necessary for them to be successful. And so those are the relationships that energize me and get me really excited when I wake up, because when you see somebody write like a multi-page memo of all the things that grind their gears about your product, or about how an issue in your product is causing them to lose sleep, it obviously helps make it more visceral and more acutely aware of the things that you can improve on as a team.
And just to add to that, I think to give back to that relationship, right? They give you a lot and they get a product in return, but also give them early access to new features, co-develop new features with them, right? We did that with Snick as well and a few others. Like get them involved, because then they will be more excited about what you're doing.
Yeah, we generally do roadmap reviews as well, like what's upcoming down the pipeline. We look for design partners. If we don't get enough design partners for these features, we don't build the features, right? So the goal is obviously to think of these early customers as partners in what you're building, and actually make sure that you're getting the right feedback, the right validation before you end up building any new feature as well, or any new solution to their pain points.
Definitely. There's another question around tools and methods around tracking and prioritizing, road mapping, customer discovery feedback. Any tips or tools to use? You already mentioned Grain, Patrick, but what were either of you using or are using?
Yeah, we were pretty low key here. So we used Grain and Notion. So all of our customer research calls were recorded in Notion. Now everything's in Confluence, which same. And then we use spreadsheets to try to quantify some of that. We looked at tools like Dovetail as well, which I'd recommend folks looking at, or Grain. You can tag things in Grain, which makes it really easy to kind of do some cross-call synthesis. But generally, like I feel the user research aspect for us was mostly just getting as much insights as we can from each call, and then sharing that out to the broader team. The goal, again, like if you have a startup, is to make sure that everybody is aware of the pain points that customers are facing, not just a select few. So making engineers aware, making designers aware, involving them on calls, sharing any of the key insights after each call is definitely important, and helps get everybody kind of aligned on what we're building, why we're building it, and what success looks like.
Yeah, I think for us as well, we have been super low key as well for all of these. This single tool that we use is Slack. So usually after every conversation, whoever was leading the conversation, they'll summarize it in one channel, and then we'll sort of like, tag relevant folks in the team. And then that will sort of like ensue sort of like a follow-up discussion internally around what should be the next action. And if we, let's say, see certain patterns emerging through various conversations, then that's yet another sort of like Slack conversation for the rest of the team. And that's how we do sort of like much of our roadmap planning too. And that sort of like has an added advantage that given that the entire team that we have is currently remote, so everybody is on the same page and they are participating in those conversations as well. And Slack does a pretty good job of keeping track of all the history. Hopefully someday we'll invest in some CRM tool of sorts, but it's sort of like further away from that.
Yeah.
How do you map the needs and features and prioritize? So you get like 15 feature requests across many customers. How do you prioritize them?
Yeah, I think it has a lot to do with product vision as well. Of course, if you have 10 customers, those 10 customers may be asking for 25 different things. And you have to pick and choose your battle. And you have to ultimately, at the end of the day, yes, of course, you have to deliver an exceptional product experience, but you have to build a company as well. You have to keep sort of like, the financial incentives aligned as well. I don't think there is sort of like a hard and fast rule. Ultimately, at the end of the day, it's a judgment call. And many times we get it right, many times we get it wrong. So yeah, that's the process that we have been following so far. Figure out like, what is sort of like the most common pain point, how can we solve that common pain point in a way such that A, it delights our users, B, it also sort of like ensures that we have future revenue potential. And then also another sort of like aspect here is, at the end of the day, we are shipping a critical piece of infrastructure on top of which, our users are building sort of like their own critical sort of like ML applications. And we want to guarantee strong stability as well as backwards compatibility. So we can't sort of like be very hasty in shipping something and then just like pulling it back just because it didn't land well. So there's sort of like some amount of extra thought that has to go in, because otherwise, you end up sort of like in a scenario where you end up alienating some of your customers, because I mean, at the end of the day, the customer doesn't ever make the distinction between sort of like, what is a GA feature versus what is an experimental feature. So you have to tiptoe that line very carefully.
The only other thing I'd add there is like, I feel like roadmap prioritization and just product management in general is a bit of an art and a science. So there's different like scientific things that you can use, like RICE or ICE when it comes to prioritization. Obviously, frequency and depth of pain are two keys. You can do a 2x2. You can use like the Kano model of understanding things across like basic expectations, performance features versus delighters. I think that's a really helpful exercise because we were a bit of an enterprise sale at the end of the day. It was very easy to understand what was blocking adoption, what was blocking us from closing customers, or once we actually closed a customer, what was blocking a customer from rolling out. So we had like kind of key success criteria built in kind of the life cycle of each customer that we were working with. And that's, even to this day, I still feel like it's very much of an art, less of a science, although there's definitely a science component to it.
Yeah. I don't know if you remember, Patrick, but iteratively, I created like another field in our CRM to track feature requests on the account level. And then, I mean, it's just a little hack, right? And then you can look at, if you are sort of sales led, look at the opportunity amount associated with each of your feature requests. And suddenly the whole world changes if you suddenly have 2 or 3 features where all the opportunity value is associated with. So while that should always be the guiding principle, it can be helpful in closing accounts.
I wish we had that today.
Well, we should have with product board, more or less. I think we're just not using it right. So it's another tool potentially to look at. But yeah, just adding a field in your CRM and tracking it is an option too. More questions from here. So while working with a design partner, how do you monitor the customer experience with the alpha product and incorporate the feedback?
Yeah. So for us, so we have a specific product development philosophy. So even before we write any line of code, we first write the user-facing documentation for it, like what is going to be the user story, how are people actually going to use it, and that's what we share with our design partners first, and we iterate on it with them, because if they do not understand what the functionality is and what are the pain points that it's solving, then it's really hard for us to also sort of do a good job at building what we have promised. And that also sort of many times uncovers additional patterns, additional features that we should be building out in our product. And now, given sort of our current deployment pattern, it's really difficult for us to invest in any specific tracking or Google Analytics or amplitude of sorts to figure out how people are actually sort of using our product. We do a lot of screen share sessions with our users as well to sort of just understand areas that they are sort of stumbling through, paper cuts, pain points. We have a fairly active Slack channel where many of our customers, they frequently sort of come to us posting questions, and we do a rigorous analysis of the pain points that people are running into over and over again, and if there's something that we can do on that angle. I mean, I guess when it comes to enterprise, the other sort of issue is that the number of customers that you're dealing with, they are sort of of the orders of tens and hundreds. So running A/B tests is also rather tricky, because any cohort that isn't getting the absolute best experience, there's a huge cost to it as well. So up until now, we have relied mostly on sort of qualitative conversations with our customers, as well as sort of just sharing early design docs, early documentation to get a good grasp at how a feature will land.
It's pretty similar to kind of how we did that as well. So we relied pretty heavily on the qualitative side in the early days, and then kind of leaned more into the quant as we kind of scaled out. But we definitely had, before we opened up the product to generally availability, we did kickoffs with each one of our customers. So they would actually share their screen while they set up the product, which means that we're able to capture a bunch of insights. We're able to kind of see what their first impressions of the experience was, which was super helpful when we were actually building out our onboarding flows, making it really easy for when we actually turned on kind of the PLG motion for that to kind of work a little bit more seamlessly. The other things that we did is we had very easy ways for customers to send us feedback. So we had feedback collectors in the product. At the time we were using Intercom. We had session recording in the product. So even when we actually enabled self-service signup, it was very easy. I literally would, at the end of the day, just grab a coffee or a cocktail or a beer and just watch all of our users go through our experience for the entire day. It would take me 30 minutes to an hour, but it was better than Netflix. It was definitely more exciting. And so I would recommend that if you do have a SaaS-based application, is to kind of invest in some of those tools, because it's just really easy for you to see. We detected, or we saw a lot of bugs, and then we'd fix the bugs the next day, and then things would get better. And for my mind, it's all around trying to continuously improve the experience, just getting 1% better kind of every day, and then that obviously compounds over time. On the more of the quantitative side, we obviously were dogfooding a lot of our own product experience, so we had the quantitative data. So we were able to use that data for things like marketing automation, or being able to do better cohorting, or understanding what features were being adopted or not being adopted across different cohorts. And Francisca hooked up a bunch of our onboarding flows and kind of feature discovery flows that were actually using those events in the early days. So there was a lot of value beyond just kind of the behavioral analysis side.
For sure. I also spent hours in LogRocket.
Yeah.
Have we lost Francisca?
Looks like the internet went down.
Yeah.
The internet might have gone down till she.
Fun as Netflix.
You're back.
Oh, sorry. I just said I also spent hours in LogRocket, and then, but I didn't find it more exciting than Netflix. There's another question. I'll take yours, Apuva. How should dev-focused companies be thinking about building user communities, whether open source or not? If anyone wants to start building, assembling a community, where do they start? Maybe that's one for you, Savin.
Yeah. I mean, as Patrick mentioned before, right? People are always eager to talk about problems. and not really sort of like, discuss a specific vendor focused tool. So the best approach of starting a community, and, a community as well as an open source product, these are like two orthogonal concerns. Like, you can have a company that's building something closed source, but still have a great community around it. And I think the best way to sort of like start the community, seed the community, is to just like put yourself out there, go to conferences, go on podcasts, start discussing the problem. It's not really necessary that you need to sort of like lead with a solution, but I think there are many folks out there who are happy to spend time talking about the problem and brainstorming what potential solutions can be. And I think that's an excellent way of starting a very healthy community, because at the end of the day, people do not want to sort of like, participate in a community as bystanders, right? Like, early on, you want people who are actively participating. They see sort of like, a win in their participation. And the one way to sort of like, deliver that is making sure that, whatever solution you're building, whatever tool you're building, whatever is the end goal of that community, they see themselves as sort of like, having contributed actively in that.
For sure. And it also doesn't always mean starting your own community, right? Like, Patrick, you didn't, or we didn't start our own. We were just sort of embedding into existing ones.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think there's pros and cons. Like, for me, it's always like go find a community. It's easier to go find an existing community than seed one for your company. Also, I feel like it's more like it short circuits a lot. So obviously there's like activation energy needed to get a community off the ground. It really relies on hiring a full-time community manager in my mind at some point. Like, obviously founders can do that in the early days, but ultimately I feel like the communities like DBT, like Claire Carroll, that was like her full-time gig for quite some time to get that off the ground. So I feel like it does take a lot of effort. So in my mind, I'd recommend seeing if there is an existing community before going and trying to build your own. Obviously, building your own is kind of the long-term goal, I think, for a lot of organizations, but at least in the early days while you're still finding product market fit, I would go where your customers already are.
For sure. There's an interesting question here. So for new categories that are yet to be established, for example, ML ops, how do you separate signal from noise? Many organizations feel they need to invest in it due to fear of missing out, but I'm not sure how this specific category could add value. So how do you craft your message and approach for such companies?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very relevant question for me, because this is the industry that we work in. And I mean, of course, it's very true that there's a lot of noise. There's some amount of signal as well, and it's very tricky to sort of like, distinguish signal from noise. But then early on, within sort of like the lifetime of a company, I don't think it's prudent to spend a lot of time convincing companies that may not by themselves be convinced of the value add. I think there are still enough number of companies in the universe of MLOps who have felt the pain, who understand the value, and who do not need to be convinced that they need to actually invest in this area. And I think those are the companies that are sort of like best design partners early on, and they help you sort of like learn what is the right messaging for your product. And then over a longer period of time, as the industry matures more, then many of these other companies who are not sort of like really sort of like fully caught on to what their level of investment must be, you can either hope that they get to sort of like that point over the course of time, or as sort of like a side activity, you can also sort of like start engaging with these companies and understand like, okay, what is going to be your pitch to them. And you may not want to convert them in the next month or so, but then hopefully sort of like, a year down the road, a couple of years down the road, they may be ready to sort of like buy what you are selling.
Anything to add, Patrick?
Yeah, I think I find category creation kind of a fascinating topic, generally speaking. I don't know if folks have read the book called Play Bigger, but it was like something that was, I thought, very interesting when it comes to like building kind of long lasting companies. For me, it's like, it's easy to kind of draft off of existing categories quite often if you're kind of even if you're a new entrant to an existing space. If you're building out something completely new from scratch, it's like, how do you differentiate from an existing category? So a lot of times if there is a new category, there's also models for what that category looked like previously, either in other industries or kind of tangentially related spaces. So like, I feel like for folks and for customers, it's really nice to be able to kind of have a bridge between either an existing category to this new category that's emerging, or this new category that you're trying to create as an organization. If you don't build that bridge, it's really hard for them to kind of grasp the impact here, kind of like what you're doing. So while I feel like a lot of venture capitalists focus on category creation, and I think it's really helpful for startups to focus on category creation as well, it's really hard for a customer to understand exactly, again, yeah, what's smoke and mirrors here, and what does the product actually do. So I think just being truthful and honest with your marketing, understanding exactly like, hey, how do I simplify this so that a layperson might understand it, is definitely helpful.
What was the biggest learning or frustration that you both had with early sales, early go to market?
Procurement.
Full stop.
I mean, this is more enterprise sales, so I'm happy. Well, what I would consider enterprise sales. So I mean, procurement. I don't know if folks have ever had to deal with procurement, but there's full-time people. There's a full-time job in most large organizations whose job is to just beat you down on price. The earlier you understand that, the better. The earlier you understand that this is a process, the better. Sales is a complete, like, similar to like engineering or design, there's like a function whose job is to get really good at this, right? So as a founder, if you don't have experience in sales, like my recommendation would just go shadow somebody, or like just get a sales advisor or mentor where you can learn from, because like it was definitely something that I feel like I had to learn from the school of hard knocks. And we had some advisors who try to give me feedback, but yeah, it was until you go through the process, it's really, really hard. We had to negotiate a contract with a French company, and I think we were talking about like 3K at the end of the day. And I was super head stubborn, and I didn't want to negotiate, and then ended up driving like the sales process just out for, I dragged the sales process out like 2 months over 3K, which is inconsequential to them. It should be, it's multi-billion-dollar company, inconsequential to them, inconsequential to us. And like, again, just trying to find ways to like short circuit your sales process would be my recommendation. And then just understanding that there's a process and there's a playbook that you can follow similar to anything else. The other thing that obviously was frustrating is red line negotiation. So we never had to deal with this at Atlassian. There's only one custom contract that a company in New York has, because an intern signed the deal. Other than that, everybody agrees to the same terms of service, the same end user license. So like not having to get into the business of doing red line negotiation or contract negotiation, that I spent hours that I will never get back because I had to do that. Again, you either decide that this is something that you want to do or something that you don't want to do, and you can kind of design your sales process around that. Those are the two things that I found frustrating or took away my energy, did not give me energy as a founder.
And if you do decide on the red line option, add a 0 to your price tag, right?
Yeah.
Savin, what about you?
Yeah, I think, so I've been a software engineer throughout my career. So the biggest sort of like learning for me was definitely sales. How do you actually sort of like, talk to these customers who come from many different backgrounds as well, right? Like being in a big tech company is a very different environment, because, a company like Netflix will already sort of like screen people for certain behavioral traits and how people communicate. And like, it's communication is a well-oiled machinery inside a large organization. But when you sort of like step out and now you have to talk to like 10 different organizations, 20 different organizations, and you're not even familiar what their internal incentives are in terms of them engaging with you, that's a good amount of learning. And I'm pretty sure being good at sales is definitely a superpower for early founders.
For sure. There's a few more questions. I really want to ask this question though, and then I'll take the last ones in the chat. How many no's did you get along the way? Like, I feel like a lot of founders they get very sad when they get a no or get deterred, but want to hear, like, did you get any no's?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, you hear, I mean, like the question is like, as a founder, your job is to be persistent to some extent. It's like learning, like speed of iteration, speed of learning, Like having kind of an experimentation driven process is super valuable here, because your goal is to continuously improve. And that's on sales, that's on pitching investors, that's on hiring. It's the goal is to like think of everything as like, oh, like how do you constantly improve the way that you're working and building product, whatever it is. With sales, like you're always going to hear no's. I think the reasoning to the best thing to do is when you hear a no is like understand why, right? So like figure out what your closed loss reasoning is, and then figure out what you can do from an exception handling standpoint, like building in FAQs or understanding kind of what that playbook looks like. As a founder, your job is to build that playbook for your first sales hire. So like, I feel like that's super valuable, is just getting the feedback from the customer if they decide that like, hey, this isn't right for them, or if they decide to go to a competitor, like understanding why, because this will help you build a better product, but ultimately build a better culture, and think of this as part of your culture. At the end of the day, I think this is part of the culture. So yeah, I mean, we've talked to, I don't know, Francisca, how many signups did we have at Iteratively over the course of the year that we were in market independently? It's like hundreds, and like how many of those converted to paid was smaller. And then out of all those that converted to paid, I mean, we've had conversations with way more than that. The goal is obviously to codify that learning and then figure out ways to improve over time. Even today, like when we hear no's at Amplitude, it really tries, like, again, it goes back to discovery, like try to figure out as much information as you can around why they're saying no.
Yeah, I mean, for us as well, right? Like it's not the no's that hurt, it's the maybes that hurt the most. Because I mean, with no's, you get a clear feedback in terms of why the product isn't resonating. But then, you know, when you're sort of like, when it's a maybe and it stretches on for far too long, then you're always sort of like searching, like, you know, what went wrong where, and that can be really painful and disappointing.
Yeah, I'd say there's even one that's worth, with his customers that say yes, you close, you convert, you actually capture the revenue. The revenue's in your bank, and then they don't activate. Because then it's like, wait, they had the pain point, then is it a solution? Like, is it a solution issue, a timing issue? It's like dead revenue is like something that makes me cry at the end of the day. It might not make investors cry, but definitely makes me cry as a founder, because it means that I haven't done my job. Right? Like we ended up selling something. This person said they had the pain, but for whatever reason, they're not activating on the software that we're building. Definitely keeps me up at night.
Yeah. And be sure to track your, if you are sort of top down, track your close loss reasons again in your CRM, so you can understand over time why and how things change. Okay, I think we have room for maybe one more. There's a specific question for you, Savin. What are the specific existing communities where you're engaging with developers and learning about their problems?
Yeah, I mean, you know, like over the last couple of years, most of these communities are all online and virtual. So they're like, you know, a bunch of subreddits, are data engineering, machine learning, that you can sort of like, you know, frequent if you're interested in machine learning and ML infrastructure space. On Slack as well, Dimitrios is doing a great job with MLOps community. You know, there's another one called Max Pool. Then Chip has a very active community on Discord as well. And now the good thing about sort of like, you know, all of these communities is that it's frequented by people who are sharing their pain points and who want to sort of like learn what is out there. And to Patrick's point, right, like observing these communities is pretty much like, you know, observing a category getting created from the grounds up. And if you sort of like, you know, just scroll back and look at like, you know, the kind of questions that people were asking 2 years ago and what they're asking right now, they are very different. And as a startup founder, it's not only important to sort of like pick up what are the pain points, but then also what are the trends, because, you know, you need to go where the puck is going and you need to build for like 2 years out, 4 years out. And just observing sort of like the historical trends in these communities, that has been really, really helpful for us.
Awesome. We're at time. I had so many more questions. Maybe we can do a round two sometime. Thank you so much, Savin and Patrick. Thanks for joining us. And I'm sure if you have any specific questions, reach out to any of us and we'll be happy to answer and help out.
100%.
Bye, everyone.